welcome to the 495. I am your host, Doug Sparks, editor-in-chief of Merrimack Valley Magazine. Lou, how are you doing this week?
Doing very well today. It's been a lot of technical issues today.
Yeah. And I
carried over into your show.
Yes. Well, they've been resolved.
Yeah.
I, as I was telling you before the show, am miserable.
Yeah.
Because I was stung by yellow jackets yesterday, and I'm allergic to yellow jackets. In fact, at a certain point in my life, I was so allergic to yellow jackets that I would go into anaphylactic shock and be within minutes of death. So
Wow.
I
starting
on a high note.
As if they're not bad enough.
As if they're not bad enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had some incidences in my life that were no fun, where I was kind of seconds away from disaster. So they put me on injection therapy. So I can tolerate the stings now, but I still get a reaction to them. So
what does that entail, injection therapy?
So it takes going weeks and weeks and weeks to an allergist, and you get these injections, and you have to kind of sit around. They have to monitor you to make sure you don't have a reaction to the small amount of the venom that they're giving you.
So tolerance buildup.
Yeah, they build up the tolerance over time, and then you're supposed to, so you go, it's like weekly, and then it becomes monthly, and then it becomes 4 times a year, and then it sort of trails off after that. So my right forearm is puffed up like Popeyes. I've got a little bit of a Popeye look going on here in my arm. I'll spare everyone. I was stung a couple times in the chest and belly.
Yeah.
So that was that, and then for some reason it gives me this crazy headache. So if I go down and tie my shoes or something, it feels like my eyeballs are going to pop up.
Well, thanks for coming.
Good times, right?
Yeah,
exactly. What a lead-in for Ryan. Our guest today is Ryan Turner. He's the new music director at the Newburyport Choral Society. Ryan, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Doug.
Hey, so
can you hear me?
I can hear you absolutely. So I want to start a little bit with a digression before we get into the Newburyport Choral Society and who you are and how you got involved. You're also a music educator. And,
yes, I am.
And I just think this must be a really challenging time. You tell me, right? Maybe it's a time of opportunity for music educators, given what's going on in the pandemic. And I don't think it was easy before the pandemic. And now this sort of crisis must change everything, right?
Well, yeah, it does. There are definitely some huge obstacles to learning, especially when we're talking about music, which is a synchronous activity. And as we know, there are very few platforms, if any at all, that are truly synchronous to teach music online or virtually. So much of what music is about is the communication that happens from individual to individual, and the sense of community that happens in making music, and the sharing of emotions and of a message. And when filtered through Zoom or whatever platform you're using, there's a lot of that's lost.
Right.
So, yeah, it presents a number of challenges. I teach at the Longy School of Music, which is a graduate conservatory in Cambridge. And, there are so many different models we're trying to make it all work. But, yeah, it has its challenges. But it also, I'm trying to look at this with the glass half full mentality so I don't drive myself crazy.
Sure.
And try to recognize there are some opportunities that present themselves.
Yeah. So what are you doing as far as opportunities? What are you looking at?
Well, one of the things that happened, I teach a course at the Longy School of Music on the history of oratorio, and a seminar, performance and historical seminar in oratorio, which was always in person. And one of the things we're doing now is we're doing it with recorded accompaniment tracks, which the benefit from that is that the level of preparation from the singers, the students, is exponentially better, because the amount of practice they have to put on to synchronize their singing with a pre-recorded track makes them that much more prepared. And it also enables, I think, for a slightly more robust conversation on Zoom than one has in person. And it enables everybody to have a voice in a way they wouldn't otherwise have.
So it's another kind of minor digression, but I have to ask you because I like asking music people about this, and I wanted to ask about the streaming services because for a lot of people, the streaming services that's the main way they get music. That's the main way they listen to recorded music, and the options right now aren't great for classical and early music. What do you think of the streaming services, or do you listen to vinyl or CDs, or do you personally have another method of listening?
I subscribe to Apple Music, and I use that, and I also have, Amazon Prime that I use. I feel like I'm making a commercial right now, but but there are a number of organizations now that have started their own YouTube channels. Like, for example, in the classical world in Boston, there's the Boston Symphony channel. There's Boston Baroque has one. I think the Handel and Haydn Society does. There's BMOP, which is the Boston Modern Orchestra Project. They have their own radio station online. So there are a number of options depending on where your affinity within the classical music genre lies.
Right. But YouTube doesn't, well, I don't know, at least with my sound system, YouTube isn't going to give you the sound quality even of like a CD.
No, it definitely doesn't. And that's one of the challenges unless you have, like I just purchased a really good Bluetooth speaker that attaches to that I can use to sync up to my computer, and I can get good sound. But,
yeah.
And generally speaking, you're not going to get great sound coming out of your laptop.
Sure. So when did you first get involved with the Newburyport Choral Society?
Well, this is a very new position for me. I was just appointed back in March or April, I believe it was, and my work began in April and then officially in June. So there's a gentleman before me, Dr. George Case, who was with the group since 2014. He stepped down. He was moving to New Mexico, and they did a search, and I applied. I live about 15 minutes from Newburyport here in the Merrimack Valley.
Yeah, you're in Haverhill, correct?
I'm in Haverhill. And one of the things I've always been interested since we moved to Haverhill 8 years ago was how can I get involved in making music within my own community as opposed to just doing stuff in Boston and Cambridge and, nationally and internationally, but how can I make music in my own community?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit I was a little surprised when I found out you lived in Haverhill because of some of the other work you do when you're not working with the Choral Society is Boston-centered, right? So why do you live in Haverhill?
Well, I live in Haverhill because my wife's family is from Groveland. She grew up in Groveland, just over the river. And so we're about 8 minutes away from her family. All my family's in Texas, so I'm a long ways away from them. Her family's all within 15 minutes. We have 2 kids, so it's nice for them to be near family. We liked the area, and even though most of my work is in Boston, one of the things that I've often wanted in my own career was to have this sort of what I call the 3-legged stool of making music. And the first is in education, the second is professional, and the third is community. And it was important to me to fulfill that community aspect of, and I feel like one of the things that's important for musicians is it's easy for us to get sort of insulated in looking for the next best, most professional project. And I think what's in some ways more important is giving back to your community and finding a way that the making of music is more at a grassroots level that's simply about the joy of making music and less about the highest, cutthroat professional standards, but about the community of people making music together.
Yeah, it still seems like a big, maybe the word isn't burden, but it's a lot, right? Because all of these elements of this stool you're talking about require a lot of work and effort and focus and concentration, all right? And then you say, well, I'm going to do all of these things, right? I'm going to be an educator, a performer, and I'm going to, do what I can to bring this music to the community. It seems like a lot. You must drink a lot of coffee or not sleep a lot, or like how do you do this? How do you work this?
Yes to all of those, but when you love, this may sound cliche, but when you love what you do, it doesn't seem like work. And much of the time, I feel really fortunate in that my job is to make beauty with all the people around me and teach people how to make beauty. And so it doesn't necessarily feel like work. I mean, yes, there's a lot of the administrative end of things, the planning, that takes time, but, it's toward a bigger goal. And, I have 2 small children, and my wife is also a musician. So balancing our schedules presents numerous challenges, but we work through it. And I guess it's the only thing I know how to do. So I've been a professional musician since, the early 90s. So
yeah. So you grew up in Texas?
I grew up in El Paso, Texas, and then I moved to Dallas in 1990 to go to undergrad, at Southern Methodist University.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Boston in 95 to go to the Boston Conservatory, and I've been in the New England area since 95.
Yeah, I mean, Texas isn't the first state I think of when I think of Bach and Mozart. How was your path to music in El Paso? Where did that come about?
I always sang in a church choir as a kid. I sang in the El Paso Children's Chorus. My mother led the church choir at our Lutheran church growing up. I picked up the violin. I picked up cello just because I had an interest in it. But most of it was, my interest as a kid was not in classical music. I played fiddle in a bluegrass band. I sang my mom used to take me to country western nightclubs, and I'd sing with the band there. It was an odd upbringing in that way, but it led me to classical music because it's an interesting story in that my mother had a very close friend who was working on her PhD in voice at University of Texas, El Paso, and the focus of her dissertation was the male changing voice. So as I was going through puberty and my voice was changing, I was essentially her case study. And so I had voice lessons and had a teacher that took me through the change of voice and really instilled a passion in classical music for me, and led me to SMU to study, and one thing led to another. And I came to Boston actually thinking what I wanted to do was musical theater, and I had a voice teacher that gently led me in the direction that I think was the best choice for me, especially towards earlier music and Bach, and then that led to the conducting opportunities. And I wouldn't say I took a traditional path to where I am now, that's for sure.
Do you still listen to country music?
Yeah.
I daily, and bluegrass, and
oh, great.
Yes, in fact, I try not to listen to classical music too much.
Why is that?
Oh, I think because it's always in my head, I'm much of my day is spent either at the piano, listening to music I'm working on, practicing, looking at a score, and it's in my head. It's important for me to sometimes turn off that part of my brain and also realize there's a whole other world out there that exists that doesn't know a thing about Bach or Mozart, or it's not even part of their vocabulary. And I like it. I like listening to other types of music.
Yeah. You know, it's funny you mention that, because Julie Skolnick, who's the music director at Mistral Music, she was on the podcast a couple of months ago, and she said she didn't listen to classical music almost at all at home, and mostly listened to folk.
Yeah. Which
I found surprising. I guess. But it makes perfect sense. Did you see the Ken Burns PBS multi-part series on country music?
I saw parts of it. I didn't see all of it, but yes, I did see some of it.
Yeah. It's fantastic.
No, I didn't even know it existed.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, it's great because there's some amazing footage. And I like a lot of country music, particularly older country music, and there's a lot of footage I hadn't seen, but the way it puts everything into a historical context, I felt like my brain was being put inside of a rocket ship and sent off to Mars. It was a lot to absorb, and It's really worth checking out. So that's cool. So tell me more about the Newburyport Choral Society, because we have people listening who live in Lowell and Lawrence, and they might be a little bit far away from Newburyport, and they might not know much about the organization, when it started, who's involved.
Yeah. So Newburyport Choral Society is an 85-year-old organization that is a community chorus that's dedicated to the cultural enrichment of its members and of the community. It's a non-auditioned choir of about 130 voices, give or take, depending on the concert. So everyone is welcome. It's not one of these things where you've got to come in and audition for the conductor and, pass a certain audition standard. Everyone is welcome. And what's great about that is that there is a wide range of experience and talent. Some people read music, some don't. Some are great singers, some are new to it. And there's a real sense of camaraderie in the way the members lean on each other to learn the music, learn more about singing, learn more about the musical background, learning about reading music. Some are learning by ear. The focus is all classical music, but there are sometimes, little divergence that the group might take to pops concerts or jazz or, something like that. They meet every Tuesday nights, basically from September through May for rehearsals, and usually 2 concerts a year, a holiday concert, and then one in May. And both concerts are usually with a professional orchestra.
Yeah. Now, some members have been involved with the society for decades, correct?
Oh, indeed. Yes. Since I'm new to the group, but I'm just getting to meet everybody, I've been having I had a series of Zoom calls with 16 people on each call from the group to get to meet all of the members, which was fascinating to get to meet them individually and learn about people that, have been in the group since the late 70s, early 80s. That's, the tremendous amount of history that they have with the group is exciting to hear about.
What do you think?
And then there are a number of new members as well.
Sure. Why do you think, what is it about this society that makes people want to continue doing this for decades?
Well, there's really nothing that one can compare, I think, to choral singing. The idea of you yourself are the instrument. It's not, the instrument isn't something external. It's not, a violin or a flute or a trumpet that you put in a case, but you are the instrument. And the idea of sharing that with someone next to you, someone across the room, sharing it with an audience, there's a vulnerability that comes with singing because you are the instrument. And the idea of doing it in a group, there's a sense of safety and comfort as well, as opposed to a solo singer who's really sort of putting themselves out there. But knowing you have, 129 other comrades with you to do this and share this music. And unlike a instrument, the voice is the only one that has text. So there's that added layer of communication where one can share amazing poetry as well. And there's this rich history of, 1,000 years of music history that one can share through singing in a community group. And there's also, and I think this is the part that's been perhaps the most challenging during this pandemic, is there's the social aspect of singing and gathering in a group together. And that's where I think there's been the most heartbreak among our members, who's been not being able to gather in a group together, because there's a tremendous social aspect of singing together.
Sure. In some of these members, it's my understanding, they're not just people who live in Newburyport and the immediate towns, right? People come from a distance to participate in this, right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, my understanding is we have some members, all the way in Haverhill, Bethune, up to Exeter, New Hampshire, and all around Newburyport, Rowley, Newbury, etc. There's a member from Danvers, so it's all across the Merrimack Valley and the North Shore.
Yeah. So as far as people getting involved, at least traditionally, say there's no audition process, so anyone can do this. I could, pre-pandemic, I could sign up and start showing up at the rehearsals, correct?
Exactly.
Can you imagine, or in these types of organizations, do you ever get people who just kind of don't have it, where you have to sort of take them aside and say, listen, we appreciate your passion, but, maybe you can help us in other ways?
Well, this, not that I know of, and I have no plans for that, of course. 10 years ago, I conducted a group in Concord, New Hampshire, Concord Chorale, which was a community chorus as well, but it was an auditioned community chorus of about 75 members. So there was a whole audition process where there was some filtering out, and you could decide and redirect people and say, hey, maybe once you work on these things and come back in a year. That's not the case at all with the Newburyport Choral Society. One of their big part of their mission is to have access. Everybody has access to the group, no matter what. So no, there is no filtering out process. If somebody is struggling, we pair them up with somebody who isn't, and that can sort of have a musical choral buddy, as it were, alongside of them to help them along the way.
So let's see plans. So you right now. Actually, I want to get to the big question now, and the big question is what's happening? What's happening this fall? What's happening this winter? What can we expect?
That's a great question. Something that we've been talking about all summer long, and we'll be making some final decisions coming up actually in the next week or so. But we will continue. I mean, Newburyport Choral Society is not going away. We have a sort of new normal, as it were. We've learned throughout this pandemic that choral, singing is sort of what we call a super spreader event because of the amount of droplets, the aerosolization when one sings, and the force at which it comes out of your mouth. It spreads like the 6-foot rule doesn't apply to singers. We need to have more space. So the idea of us coming together as a group before a vaccine or before there's more safety is not realistic. So we are going to have weekly rehearsals via Zoom from the safety of each member's home. And it will now be more of until we're able to come back for a concert, we're going to spend a lot of time digging deeper and laying choral foundations and talking about music in a deeper way, talking about vocal pedagogy, doing warm-ups. We're going to have some guests come talk to us, almost expanding it to more of an adult education program until we're able to meet in person again. And we're also going to sort of experiment with some virtual choir activity. But so far, the members are very enthusiastic. I mean, there was an annual meeting just a few weeks ago, and we had nearly 100 members on Zoom participating, and I anticipate they will all show up every Tuesday night for our weekly rehearsals that will be on Zoom. And we'll also have the chance to look and start to rehearse on Zoom the music that we'll be doing in our spring concert.
So can new people get involved right now?
Most definitely. In fact, I think in some ways it's a great time to get involved because we have the gift of time in that we're not preparing for a holiday concert. So often when a new conductor takes over the group, the first thing they're faced with is you got to get a concert on its feet. You only have a few number of weeks, and you're going to be performing in public. And of course, that's the first judge of how things are going, is what's the concert like. But what we have now is the opportunity to sort of dig deeper into some of the choral foundations and singing pedagogy and looking deeper into the music and getting to know each other. And we're going to reach out to high schools and college students and church choirs. So I think it's actually a great time to join the group because you're not under the pressure of a clock for a performance, but you have an opportunity to get to know more of the people and also get to sort of establish stronger singing foundations before we go back to singing in a group in person.
Yeah. So say you do have a concert in the winter or the spring. How do you go about programming that? Are you thinking thematically? Are you thinking in terms of maybe like the national discourse or what's going on internationally? Are you thinking of the mood of the country in terms of politics? Like how much does the programming reflect what's going on in the world outside the performance space?
It reflects it quite a bit, I'd say. There seems to be, well, let me back up. we know we won't have a holiday concert. That just doesn't seem like a realistic endeavor or a safe endeavor at this point. So we're looking to hopefully have a spring concert sometime in May. And the program that I'm tentatively put together is called The Promise of Living, Remembrance and Renewal. And the idea is the first half is going to sort of essentially mourn the tragic loss that has been all around us given this pandemic. And the second half is hopefully to celebrate a sense of renewal and hope for the future. Also embedded in that program are turning our attention toward ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, we've been faced this summer with not only the health crisis, but a cultural and social crisis. And I think many arts organizations, while are heartbroken about not being able to perform together, it in a way has forced our hand to look inward and address some of the systemic exclusionary activities that we have done over the years, unknowingly, especially in the world of classical music that has focused most of its attention on the Western canon of dead white men. And so I think we have a responsibility, and I'm actually very excited about the idea of us looking forward to new composers, but also looking back at composers that have been marginalized over a number of years of history because of either their gender or the color of their skin. So one of the things, for example, that we're going to be working on is a piece by a African-American female composer from the 19th century, Undine Smith Moore, who was writing classical music, spirituals, gospel music. And so I think it's important for us to always in our programming to recognize how diverse we can be. And the hope is that, especially in the Merrimack Valley, in Newburyport, it's not necessarily an incredibly diverse community. And my own personal goal, and I'm doing this with the groups I work with in Boston as well, is trying to think about, okay, in 10 years, what do we want the classical music world to look and sound like? Any change that happens is going to take a long time, but I think what's important is that we're not looking at it as what can we do, what's a quick fix, what can we do now, what's going to be a token action, but what is something that is going to be meaningful and long-lasting. And the classical music world has been rather what I would call whitewashed over hundreds of years and has not been open to a more diverse community of performers, a more diverse community of composers. And therefore, the audiences haven't reflected who's on stage, what composers are being programmed. So my hope is that through deliberate actions as it relates to programming, as it relates to reaching out to different audiences, as it relates to reaching out to different performers, that, this is a long-term and ambitious project for any organization, but that we can, in the classical music world, begin to transform what classical music looks like.
You were the director of choral activities at Phillips Exeter for like 6 years. What was that like? And it ties into. I want to ask a little bit about what you just said, but I'm interested because that was dealing with younger people, right?
It was. I mean, these were all high school age kids, grades 9 through 12.
Yeah.
It was a very, very bright, self-motivated kids, and the majority of whom were there were boarding. These are bright kids, and the program was, I ran 3 different choirs, a women's chorus, a small chamber choir, and then a large glee club, which was about 100, a non-audition choir of about 100 kids. And what was nice about that program, which I really enjoyed, was that some of the work I was doing was introducing music to high school kids that really hadn't had the opportunity to do any choral singing. And then there was also a group of kids that were experienced and really ambitious and were striving for the highest standards in choral singing, and that was the chamber group. So it was a wide range of students that I was able to work with.
Yeah, I just wonder, I mean, as part of long-term, dealing long-term with some of these systemic issues you pointed out, how much of that involves dealing with young people and targeting young people and working with the next generation and the generation after that of performers and composers and conductors?
That's a great point, and a lot of it does. One of the things that I'm interested with the Newburyport Choral Society specifically is how we can reach out to area high schools and see if we can get some of their students involved. Also, we have an ongoing collaboration with the Greater Newburyport Children's Choir. I think it's been going on for maybe 6 years now, and that will continue. And that's an opportunity for us to work with younger singers as well. And now they've also added to it a high school group as part of that organization. So their conductor, Gina McKean's a wonderful woman who I'm having a meeting with coming up here in the next few days to talk about how that collaboration can continue. Because you're right. I mean, the other part of the sort of systemic issues within the classical music world is that it has to start in the schools. And that's a whole nother, sort of a bag of issues that have their own challenges at music education in the schools, which seems to be waning a bit, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Sure. So so you're also a performer. Do you have much time? Obviously, you're not performing anything now, but say over the past year, have you had much time to focus on your own singing, or are you really focused on directing, organizing, teaching, and these other elements of music?
Well, my singing has been less and less. 10 years ago, when I took over the job as artistic director of Emmanuel Music in Boston, that really was sort of focused my work more towards conducting, and it limited the amount of singing I could do, but I've kept singing, and I've had a few concerts in the past year, and I was scheduled to do a Big Britain concert in March before everything got canceled. That will hopefully get rescheduled at some point. And of course, at the Laundry School of Music, I also teach voice, so I'm engaged in the act of singing by working with my students. But I would say the majority focus of my musical work these days is in conducting and teaching.
So do you ever get in those moods where you're just, oh man, I wish I could just sing. I wish I could just do this one thing.
Yeah, yes. The interesting thing about singing, though, is, and I would say this only to explain why I really enjoy conducting. When you're singing, what's nice about it is that you only have to do is worry about yourself. And you're not really doing any programming. Your preparation is just about you. And there's something freeing about that. Whereas a conductor, you're doing all the programming, you're doing all the planning, you're in charge of all these people. And yet, your job is not to perform. Your job is to enable the best performances in the people around you. And that, to me, is the thing I love the most about conducting. My back is to the audience. My job is to enable the artistry around me. And it's not about me. It's about everybody else. So that's what I love about conducting the most. And while I love performing as a singer, I was always a slightly nervous singer, and there was a little bit of performance anxiety that, amazing, it goes away when your back is to the audience and the people watching you are busy doing other things.
So you're also a composer.
No, I've done a little bit of arranging, but I'm not a composer.
I thought I read in your bio that you were an opera composer, that you did some...
Opera conductor.
Oh,
I've done a number
conductor.
of opera conducting, yes.
Had bad info. Lou, do you have any questions for Ryan?
Yeah, Ryan, let me feed my my own personal interests here. and curiosities with the technical side of this. Now, COVID has forced us all into some technical situations we probably weren't ready for. And with your business and with the Choral Society, I'm guessing you have some technical challenges with Zoom rehearsals you were talking about. I don't know how that happens with the delay. And you were talking about virtual choruses. What are the challenges that COVID is presenting you technically, and how are you guys addressing them?
Well, there are numerous technical challenges. As I mentioned, Zoom, of course, is not a synchronous platform. There's a lot of latency.
Right.
So I've even noticed in my own voice teaching, it used to be I could do in person you can do a lesson, you can accompany your students. On Zoom, you can't because there's a delay. It doesn't work. So when it comes to a choral rehearsal, there's no true choral rehearsal on Zoom. Essentially what you're doing is you mute everybody and they're singing from the privacy of their own living room or wherever they may be. If I didn't mute everyone, it would be absolute chaos. Yeah. The sound would have to come back. There are there's some software out there that enables near synchronous activity, but it only works for smaller groups, and most of them require an Ethernet connection.
Right.
I'm thinking specifically, there's a great new platform called SoundJack that actually a voice teacher at the New England Conservatory, Ian Howell, created, and it works really, really well. But you couldn't do it with 130 people, and you couldn't ensure that they all had an Ethernet connection.
Right.
There's Kazam and Jamulus, which are all work for like 6 to 12 people. So for a large group like the Newburyport Choral Society, there's no real way to have a rehearsal. But as it relates to a virtual choir, the way we're going to do it is there's a new app out that's called My Choral Coach. And what it does, it has editing software within it so that one can, with one device, record to a click track, and then it submit it, and I can get 130 recordings of people singing their part, and then edit it together, and we create a virtual choir.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about. That sounds incredibly daunting, especially with 130 people.
It sure does. And so there's going to be a lot of trial and error, and it's admittedly out of my realm of experience or knowledge. So there's a learning curve for me, and I've got a lot of work to do, but it's worth it, and it's what we have to do. There's not a single conductor out there that isn't having to re-educate themselves and learn new ways to bring people together, because it's the idea of sustaining and building community is so important during this time.
It sounds like you've played on both sides of the ball throughout your musical career, instrumentally and vocally. Talk about the compare and contrast orchestrating and arranging voices as opposed to orchestrating and arranging instruments.
Well, I mean, I'll talk about it from the conducting standpoint. It's a whole, if I'm working with, in this case, the Newburyport Choral Society, a community group, and we have a wide range of people, some that read music, some don't, some that have had vocal training, some that don't. The rehearsal process is significantly longer, and I would argue that much more rewarding, because the distance traveled is so much greater than if we're talking about, like we hire a professional chamber orchestra, we do 2 or 3 rehearsals with them, and they're all professionals. And the idea is they've looked at their music before they come in and they just lay it down and they do it. So the distance traveled is a much shorter distance in terms of improvement and progress, because they're coming in at such a higher level. But I think, and for much of the orchestra, it's a paid gig. They're completely committed, but that's one weekend and then they're on to the next. It's less about the sense of community and growth and camaraderie that comes from a community choral organization.
And finally, for me, chorus and singing provide some unique challenges, especially when you're doing no rehearsal choral here or no audition choral here where people are coming in, because the challenge here, one, is dealing with harmony, which is difficult for people. That doesn't come naturally for people, I don't think. Plus, when you're working with an instrument and you fret a string or you hit a pad or you hit a key, you get that note. Vocally, it doesn't work that way, especially when you're thinking on melody and you're trying to produce a harmony, and that drift in between what you think you're producing and what you actually produce can be challenging. That's going to be especially difficult for people who are new to singing, dealing harmony within group. I mean, they have the cover, but that's still challenging.
Indeed, I love the way you articulated that. You know, when you think about a piano, middle C is always a middle C, and if you're taught where to put it, your finger goes there, and you'll always get a middle C. If I told you to sing a middle C, it would be a little bit more like a search and destroy mission.
Especially if someone standing next to you is singing a different note.
Exactly. So that, I think also that's so much about singing that is exciting is when you can master that sense of independence and create harmony with someone else. And when you start to think about it, this was, my own body that did this. I didn't need an external instrument. Everything's housed within. That's a really exciting endeavor. And indeed, there are numerous challenges that come with it because you're not, again, you can't, put your finger on a fret or on a string and say, this is where the note is and know where it is every time. But that's, that's what they train us to do, and hopefully I'll do my job well. We'll see.
Plus, by the way, when you get the payoff of good harmony, that's a real payoff.
Indeed. It's a payoff for the listener, it's a payoff for the conductor, and it's especially a payoff for the people that are in the midst of making that beauty together.
Yeah, and this is also an area where musical genres that don't seem to be connected, like bluegrass and chamber and choral music, come together.
Oh, definitely. Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned bluegrass. There's some of those great bluegrass groups that you hear sing at the Grand Ole Opry. There's a ton of harmony that goes into vocal harmony that comes into play. And interestingly, there's actually a bluegrass mass that was written for chorus and a bluegrass band. And I'm right now blanking on the name of the composer, but there are a lot of efforts in the classical music world to do this sort of crossover or this sort of melding of musical genres in that way.
Well, yeah, I hope people are inspired. If they want to learn more, they can go to Newburyport Choral Society.org. Ryan, thank you so much for being our guest today. Really appreciate it. I learned a lot. Our guest today has been Ryan Turner, the new music director of the Newburyport Choral Society. Next week, lovers of anything spicy, hot, capsaicin, Scoville units, we are doing hot sauce with Brian Rollman from Crack Hot Sauce next week. See everybody then.